Welcome to the Modern Classrooms Project podcast. Each week, we bring you discussions with educators on how they use blended, self-paced, and mastery-based learning to better serve their students. We believe teachers learn best from each other, so this is our way of lifting up the voices of leaders and innovators in our community. This is the Modern Classrooms Project podcast. Hello, and welcome to episode number 221 of the Modern Classrooms Project podcast. My name is Zach Diamond, and I'm a high school media production teacher in Washington, D.C., and of course, a Modern Classrooms implementer. And today, I am honored to be joined by Modern Classrooms Project Chief Product Officer and co-founder Rob Barnett, making his triumphant return to the podcast after, I think, like 200 episodes. Welcome back, Rob. It's so great to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you, Zach. I'm thrilled. I actually looked it up, and the last time I was on the podcast was episode 12 in November of 2020. It is incredible to see what the podcast has become, what you've done, all the amazing people we've had on the podcast over the past 200 plus episodes. Really, it's amazing, and I'm thrilled to be back.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thrilled to have you back, and it's clearly been too long. That I appreciate that. We do work really hard on the podcast, and we obviously appreciate all the listeners because you all are the reason that we do it. And I have to, of course, shout out Tony Rose, my intrepid co-host, who does a tremendous amount of work booking guests and all the sort of stuff behind the scenes. So I really appreciate that, Rob. It's like my passion project.
I mean, it's amazing to me because we've had 200 plus guests, and still sometimes I suggest to Tony Rose, hey, have you considered having this person on the podcast? And oftentimes Tony Rose will say, yeah, but we've got a backlog of months.
That's right. We do.
There's so many interesting people in our community. I feel privileged to be a part of it. And I'm grateful to you and to Tony Rose for sharing voices with our listeners.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you. And November of 2020, what a time. The podcast was in its we were talking about this before we started recording, like in its youngest days. We were like, wow, 10 episodes. What are we going to do now? And yours was episode 12. I'll link it in the show notes, of course, for listeners to go back and get a taste of what we were talking about. Or I guess that was actually you and Kareem. It was called MCP Founders Chat. And get a taste of what you all were talking about in November of 2020. Quite a time. Today, we have a completely different topic. If listeners don't know, Rob has a book coming out on February 5th, and that's our topic for tonight. And I have an advanced copy of some of it. I've read some of it. It's very good, and I'm really excited to talk about it, Rob, and I'm really enjoying reading it. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Rob, I saw also that there is a chance for our listeners to win a copy of the book?
Yes, absolutely. There's a form I've created. You can put it in the show notes. I hope anyone who listens will fill it out, and I'll gladly send a couple copies out to people who fill out the form.
Fantastic. We've got a giveaway. Sweet. So we'll put that in the show notes. And let's talk about this book. Actually, before we dive into talking about the book, let's catch up a little bit and maybe even back up a little bit because episode 12 is a long time ago. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself first before we start talking about the book? Tell us about who you are. And, we always ask how you started your Modern Classrooms journey, but in your case, you kind of started the Modern Classrooms journey. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your backstory, Rob.
Well, Zach, actually, to learn my backstory, I recommend you check out the book. No, I'm just joking, of course. Yes, it's been a long time, my Modern Classroom journey, although still invigorating and exciting. I was a high school math teacher in Washington, D.C., not far from you. I was struggling immensely. I showed up to my classes and I saw that some students were always there on time. They were ready to learn. They had grade level skills. Other students also showed up. They were excited to learn, but they had big gaps in their learning. It was difficult for them to stay on pace with what I was teaching. And some students weren't there at all. Chronic absenteeism is a huge issue now. It was a big problem for me back then. And I thought, how can I possibly teach a single lesson each day that is going to meet these learners' diverse needs? And eventually I realized I couldn't do it. I needed a different approach. And so over, the course of a year or so, I tried out a bunch of different techniques. I started with a simple instructional video. I sort of built up from there to a more self-paced lesson style, a self-paced classroom. And, 10 years later, we now call that the modern classroom instructional model. So I certainly didn't set out to be sitting here today to write a book or to, be part of this great nonprofit organization. I was a struggling teacher trying to find techniques that would work. And fortunately, I found something that worked for me. I met Kareem. We were eager to share it. And here we are.
Here we are. Yeah. Yeah. And it has affected the classrooms, so many classrooms around the world. And mine in particular, I can tell you, obviously podcast listeners have heard me gush on about the modern classrooms model. I can't speak highly enough of this approach to teaching. It has completely revolutionized how I teach and how I think about teaching, and I will obviously never go back to traditional teaching. Even as I become more experienced as a modern classroom teacher and start to integrate a little bit more of what I used to do as well, and find ways to just improve overall, the modern classrooms model is still the absolute bedrock of my teaching. And I can just sit here thanking you for this whole episode because it kind of saved my career. But that's not what we're here for. So Meet Every Learner's Needs is the name of the book, and you can hear that theme coming across even in just the sort of broad strokes of the story that you tell about your experience in the classroom. Can you just give us sort of the overall broadest, kind of a log line for the book? What is this book about, and who is it for?
Yeah, great question. I call the book 10% memoir, 10% manifesto, and 80% manual.
I love that.
So I want to tell my story and how I arrived at this model, a sort of longer version of the story I just told. And I think sometimes it's easier to learn something through a story. Humans like stories. And I think if you can understand the challenges I faced and the solutions I found and some of the hurdles I encountered along the way, that might be a good way for you to understand the modern classroom model. So I wanted to tell the story. The manifesto part is I wanted to share what I believe about education, which is that every learner deserves to be appropriately challenged and appropriately supported every day, and that our traditional model of instruction is not giving our young people what they need. And so I wanted to share that belief. But mostly what I wanted to do is make this approach as simple and as accessible as possible to teachers with the steps I took, the steps you took, the steps, many of our listeners have taken. Just share not just what I did, but what I've learned from teachers like you who are doing things, I could never have dreamed of when I was in the classroom. I've learned a lot over the past, 7 years since starting modern classrooms. And I thought the book would be a way to share the techniques that worked for me and some of the insights I've learned from teachers like you, from many of the guests who have been on the podcast. This is one place for any teacher to pick up the book, start reading, have strategies they can use right away, and also have something to work towards as they roll out their modern classroom. The last thing I'll say is that the main audience here is teachers. I wrote this as a manual for teachers, but it's also a book that I hope a teacher can give to their administrator and say, hey, I'm interested in modern classrooms. Here's what modern classrooms is about. Maybe it's a book for the Parent-Teacher Association to read and say, hey, we want to bring more responsive education to our community. Here's a technique. Maybe it's a book for policymakers to read. I mean, I want to make this model as accessible and simple as possible for as many people as are interested in learning about it.
Yeah, and I think I really like the 10% memoir, 10% manifesto, and 80% manual. That's a really great way to think about this book, which I think does a really good job integrating them. It's not one and then the other and then the other. It's all integrated, and I think that the manifesto part, you do a really good job in the book of kind of using your story, using the memoir to explain why this is so important, and then hooking me as the reader, even though I'm already obviously hooked on Modern Classrooms, to want the manual part. And I really like we're going to talk a little bit more later, I think, about the structure of the book, but I like the way that the book, you sprinkle in tips from teachers. I think you told me there are 45 teacher tips throughout the book. So all that learning that you're doing, like, you're just putting it in there too. And I think that's awesome. And in each chapter, there's a section about your story. You really bring it all home. And I can like visualize your classroom, which, to be fair, I think I saw. So maybe I have an unfair advantage, but like, it's just, as I'm reading the book, like I can see it happening. And I think that is something that is missing in a lot of PD and a lot of teacher books that I've read. The sort of like, imagine doing this in your own classroom. Here are examples of what it actually looks like. It's not like some abstract general idea that's hard to wrap your mind around. The book does a really good job using those three sort of parts, the manual, manifesto, and memoir, to paint sort of a coherent picture of what modern classrooms could look like in a hypothetical music classroom, or an English classroom, or art, or any classroom, even though you were a math teacher. And I think that the book just really succeeds at doing that. One thing I've really enjoyed about this book is you have these three students, and we kind of like follow their journey, right? David, Anna, and Troy. And they sort of fall into the like typical archetypes of what you would imagine a successful student, and like a student who is somewhat behind in terms of her math grade level, and a student who's chronically absent. And like in each of the sections, you talk about meeting the three different sets of needs. And I think that that's a really good way of making it very concrete. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Rob? Like how these three students help to like illustrate the need to meet each different student's needs?
Of course. I mean, one thing I want everyone listening to understand is I didn't wake up one day and have this idea of this is how teaching should be fully formed. I was a teacher who was really struggling with my students. I would go home at the end of the day feeling like, man, there were students today who just didn't learn anything. And so the techniques that I was using came from that struggle, came from trying things out, seeing what worked. And that's the origin of this model. So I did want to tell that story, share the successes, share the struggles as well. When I think about this model, I think sometimes models of instruction feel kind of abstract. I really did want to think about like my actual students and my actual classroom and put myself back in that position so I could write to teachers who are in that position every day. And I really thought about students that I had, and I can still picture and remember those students and what they needed and how they struggled and how they succeeded. And because I was thinking about those students, I thought I should share this with the readers. And, I didn't want to identify any students, and some of them are kind of composites of many students. But in general, I think my students fell into a couple buckets. One is the bucket that I call David in the book. This is the student who's advanced, who really needs a challenge, who wants to be an engineer and is ready for, give me the next problem, give me the advanced problem. And oftentimes that student is really difficult for us as teachers to engage because we have so many students struggling to catch up. It's like, how do we challenge that advanced student? And I always felt really bad because I knew the Davids of my class were not well served by one lesson every day. They were bored, and honestly, they were some of my biggest behavior challenges because they were bored. They would just distract their friends, and frankly, I don't blame them. I wasn't challenging them. So I really wanted to think about, how did I help David? And if you're a teacher with advanced students, how do you keep those students challenged? The next bucket I called Anna. Anna is a student who is struggling. She has struggled in math for a long time. She has never been proficient at the end of the year in math, but she's been moved ahead anyways as she gets older. And so she comes to my class lacking a lot of skills, and more importantly, lacking self-confidence. She's someone who feels she's not good at math. And, Sadly, that's what school has made her think. So a student like that is very capable, very intelligent, needs a little more support, and needs some human encouragement too, to show her that if you apply yourself, it might take you a little longer because you have those gaps, but you can learn, you can succeed. And I think everyone listening to this podcast knows a student like David, knows a student like Anna, probably knows many like both. And then the third I called Troy. Troy's a student who just missed a lot of class. And students like Troy, I don't think we give them enough attention in the education world. When you have a student who misses 3 days of class at a time and then they come back, like, of course they're not going to be prepared to engage in your lesson, right? They've missed out. And what I taught on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday was worthwhile. So how can I expect Troy to come in on Thursday and know what to do? And we could tell a student like Troy, hey, get the notes from a friend or stay after school. But that's not sufficient. He might not be able to stay after school because his life is busy. And if you could learn by just getting the notes from a friend, there would be no purpose in going to school. So we really need to think about, for students like Troy, how do we make sure we're supporting them too? And, I had a lot of students like Troy also, and this was before COVID. So now that's even more of a problem. And it helped me when I was thinking about how to explain this approach to get out of the abstract terminology and think, look, how did this help David? How did this help Anna? How did this help Troy? And only once I felt like I was doing right by David, Anna, and Troy did I feel successful as a teacher. So I think those are sort of the 4 characters of the book. And I think teachers will recognize their own students in these archetypes.
Completely. I did. I completely agree with that. And I think that those 3 students, those 3 archetypes, really encapsulate what I was trying to say about how this book does such a good job of integrating the sort of story and the manifesto and the sort of what to do specifically manual part of things. Because as you read the book, or as you go through the book, these students come up as sort of like touchstones, right? Like if you're talking about aspire to do's, in terms of the Modern Classrooms model specifically, you can say, and now David, who's always striving for more and for more advanced content, is able to do the aspire to do's, while Anna is able to prioritize. And if you're talking about self-pacing or blended learning, you can say, and now Troy, who's chronically absent, can catch up at home, or you can catch up without me having to do all of the work on the one day that he comes into class, because I've basically cloned myself as a teacher and he has access to it. And like the way that reading those stories, and because those stories do resonate with me as a teacher, and I have students like all 3 of them, it really feels natural how the model does allow us to meet the needs of these 3 very different types of students, and then by extension our own students, right? Like my students at DCI where I work, not your students at Eastern, And that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this book, is when those 3 come up, it's kind of feel like I'm kind of like following them on a little journey into Modern Classrooms. And I enjoy reading about how the model allowed you to meet their needs, because that story does resonate with me.
It definitely was a journey for all of us to figure out how to have a classroom where each of these students could be appropriately challenged and appropriately supported. But I think once I sort of came to these practices that I call the Modern Classroom model and share in the book, life became a lot easier for all of us.
Yeah, totally. For the kids too, especially I especially sort of sympathize or empathize with Anna. Like, you talk about she puts her head down. She doesn't have the confidence to succeed in math. And like that to me is very sad. And it's something, not Anna, like real students that do that. It makes me sad because we have failed them. And I say we as in like all of education, right? Anna specifically in the book, she's in, 11th or 12th grade and her math is at an 8th grade level. And there are kids like that. And this model, as you show with Anna, makes it accessible. And I think also David, like you talk about David, those kinds of kids, if they're not causing behavioral problems, if they're just bored, I still feel bad about that. Like we're failing them too. And this is why these three students or these three archetypes really did resonate with me. So I'm going to ask you a question that I think I know the answer to, and I have my own answer to, which is if you would say that this book is for seasoned modern classrooms teachers or folks who are just getting started with modern classrooms, or maybe for both. And I personally, having read a lot of it, would say both. It's very accessible. I think it would benefit all teachers, and I agree, like administrators and even parents, to read it. It really reads as a testament to the power of the model. And you mentioned, and I also mentioned these teacher tips that are throughout it to like contextualize MCP in all sorts of different classrooms, not just math. But I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. Like who in terms of people who are familiar with modern classrooms and who aren't, who do you think would most benefit from the book?
I think it's for both. I think if you're an experienced modern classroom person, I hope you will read this and I think you'll learn something from it. I think you'll learn from the story behind the model. And I think you'll also learn from some of these teacher tips. You'll just see not just what I'm doing, but what educators all over the world are doing in different countries and grade levels, similar to this podcast, which I think is so amazing in the diversity of perspectives it highlights. So I think you'll get something from this, even if you are a modern classroom veteran. When I was writing the book, I really had someone new to this model in mind. And I was trying to think how to make this as accessible and simple as possible so that a reader feels when they put down the book, okay, I know what to do. I know how it will benefit me. And I feel motivated to do this. And so I hope people who are curious about modern classrooms will find their way to the book. And if you are an experienced modern classroom educator, perhaps you can use the book as a tool to share what you're doing with your colleagues. You can recommend this book, or you can take a page and photocopy it and give it to your colleagues, and say, look, this is a strategy that works for you. At Modern Classrooms, we offer online courses. I think our online courses are great, but there are people who don't like online courses. And I think there's an extent to which a book can just give you a sort of deeper, more engaging experience than an online course can. And so I'm hopeful that this book will reach new audiences, different audiences, and let people who don't yet know understand, Zach, what you and I understand, which is that this approach really helps teachers and really helps young people. And that, above all, was my goal in writing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, as a Modern Classrooms veteran, I got a lot from this book, even if it was just validation, which as a teacher, it's really great to be able to cheer you on in your story and feel like the same is happening for me. Like, I'm like, yes, it really does work, because in some ways we're all in this together, teaching is hard. And you do talk about that, right? Like the struggle, how teaching in a modern classroom is still hard, but reading the book to me was like, yes, this is exactly how I feel. And it was fun to read for that reason. But I did get a lot from the book in terms of sort of ways to think about modern classroom, I guess the manifesto part of the book, right? Ways to frame the importance of modern classrooms and also the teacher tips, which were really interesting because, listeners to the podcast know that sometimes I will host with like teachers who are completely outside of my realm of experience in the classroom. And I learn a lot from them all the time. And I just love these little peeks into people's classrooms, and especially, like elementary classrooms that I have no experience teaching elementary school. And it's really fun to see that kind of stuff. So absolutely, definitely a lot there for a veteran MCP teacher. Hey there, listeners. This is Zach, just dropping in with some announcements and reminders for this week. The January session for our virtual mentorship program launches on January 27th, and we have scholarship opportunities available for educators in the U.S. and abroad. Many of the opportunities even include a cash stipend and state PD credits upon completion. So apply now to work with a personal mentor and to learn how to apply blended, self-paced, and mastery-based practices in your classroom. You can find more information and links to register in the show notes and to submit your application. We would love to learn with you in this new year. So I want to talk about the framing that the book uses, talking about the model in terms of meeting learners' needs. That is the title of the book, Meet Every Learner's Needs. There are lots of ways to frame the benefits of the model. I'm thinking about, we've had lots of people on this podcast talking about lots and lots of different reasons why the model is so great, like teacher sustainability, focusing on mastery. A big one for me has been focusing on building relationships with students. And I don't think anything in the book would refute any of that. All of it is valid. All of them are valid benefits of the model. You talk a lot in the book about your story and the way that you struggled to meet your learners' needs teaching traditionally. And given that this is sort of the very foundation upon which the model wound up being built, I'd like to hear you talk more about how and why specifically meeting your learners' needs was the impetus that drove you to completely change your approach to teaching and eventually develop the model and form the organization Modern Classrooms.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that at Modern Classrooms has always been challenging for us is defining what is the one kind of core benefit of a modern classroom, because there are so many benefits, in my opinion. It makes teaching more sustainable. It makes teaching more fun. You're using technology more effectively. It's more engaging for students. And narrowing it down to one sort of value proposition was not easy. I think when I was putting myself back in the state of mind of myself as a struggling math teacher at Eastern High School, I tried to think, what was I really trying to do every day that inspired me to teach like this? And in some way, it was probably just to get through the day, not feel like a failure at the end of the day. That doesn't make for such an inspiring book title. But I think it really was like, looking at my students, looking at the humans in front of me and realizing these people need different things. And my job is to challenge each of them and support each of them. And the way I think of that is that different learners need different things. And the job of a teacher is to meet those needs as best as they can. And so that's, I think, why I settled on Meet Every Learner's Needs. I'll also share a bit of data here, which is that as part of our mentorship program, we've asked for many years people to rate their most important goal for the mentorship program. And we have a long menu of things people can choose. I want to earn graduate credit. I want to use technology more effectively. I want to lead change in my community. I want to feel more sustainable. And by far the most popular year in and year out has been, I want to meet my learners' needs. And so this is on teachers' minds. This is what the teachers who come to us want. And I think this is language that resonates with teachers, because that's why if we want sustainable, easy jobs, we wouldn't become teachers. We become teachers because we want to help every young person succeed. And the way we do that is by figuring out what they need and providing it. So based on my own feeling as a teacher, based on that data from Modern Classroom Educators, I think the clearest statement of what this book is about and what we as Modern Classroom Educators aspire to do is to meet our learners' needs.
Yeah. And I think we talk so much about differentiation. It's a word that comes up so much in the world of education, like in every possible context, differentiation comes up. And I think that you've really boiled that down to, it's not so simple, right? Like the reality of things is simple, and it's that our learners are at wildly different levels in a single class, right? Let alone, all of the students, in all of your classes or that you teach or in the whole school or what have you, every single one of them is an individual human with different needs. And it's the way that education is right now. They're all in with you together, and you are the one teacher, and you need to meet all of their needs. And I think that like that's really interesting to hear that other teachers are putting that as their like main motivation for doing the training. It does make sense. And I think like we all see it. Teachers who have been in the classroom for any amount of time, like we all see it. It's an obvious problem, right? And that's a really great way of putting it. And I do see why you would frame the book in that way. And I guess in the same sense, frame the model in that way too.
The last thing I would say here is that, the last time we spoke, Zach, in November 2020, my son had just been born. He was about 6 months old. Now he's 4.5. I have another son who's 2.5. Like, they're beginning school. And I'm thinking about, what do I want for them? And what I want is for them to go to classrooms where their teachers can meet their needs. If one day they're having a bad day and they just need a little bit of, TLC, that's what I want for them. If one of them becomes great in math and needs challenge in math, like that's what I want for them. If I could just distill what I want for my own children from their education, that's what I would say. And so that was certainly on my mind as I was writing the book.
Sure. 100%. I also have 2 kids, and they are so wildly different. The 2 of them, I mean, they're, we're not concerned about one being significantly behind in grade level, but the difference is unbelievable. They come from the same household, same parents, same upbringing. They need very different things from their teachers, and that's a great point to think about. Every parent wants that for their kids. I can't think of any parent who would be in favor of their teachers forcing them to do the exact same thing every day because it's the right thing for their education. I don't think anybody buys into that, and that's another really great point. I want to ask you just a little bit more specifically about the book, the way that you structured it. So it's sort of in these 3 sort of big parts: redesigning lessons, redesigning courses, and redesigning instruction, which, clearly goes from sort of like the more specific to the more general and broad. Can you talk a little bit more about that structure, why you structured it that way, and what that allowed you to do in terms of writing the book?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think modern classrooms is a bottom-up movement. We haven't come in and said, this is how the school system should be, and we're imposing it on teachers. It's one classroom at a time, one teacher at a time. And for me, coming up with this approach, it really was one lesson at a time. The first thing I had to figure out as a teacher was not, how should I run my classroom for this year? It was, how can I get through one day where every student is engaged, challenged, and supported? And that was an easier problem to address because I was just trying to plan one really good lesson. And so I talk about sort of my process for planning that modern classroom lesson. And it is, the modern classroom model may be complex, but the process of planning a single lesson is much more simple. You need some way of digitizing your direct instruction, whether you record a video or you find one online. After students watch the video, they should practice, ideally together, so they can apply what they've learned. And then there's a mastery check. And while all this is going on, you kind of circulate the room and support your students. And it's really as simple as that. A video, practice, mastery check. And I wanted to start with these small steps because I think that is the foundation of everything else, right? You can't have a great modern classroom for a year or have change throughout your school until you know how to give a single good lesson. And so it starts with redesigning lessons. That's certainly how it started for me. And I think that's how it started for you. I mean, I remember, Zach, when we did the fellowship in 2019.
I've told this story before, but I visited you all at Eastern one day with the cohort that was going to wind up in that training in 2019, in the summer of 2019. I saw Kareem's progress tracker on the board. That was a Friday, and I literally that day went back to school, and I still taught one more class that day, and I had made a tracker, like a sort of a proto tracker I just like on the board put a table and wrote everyone's name and put X's on the lessons that they had to do. But that was the first step for me. It was definitely starting small. And I'll also add, I know I interrupted you, and I'll let you continue in a second, but I'll also add that countless guests on the podcast have given that advice, is to start small, right? Make a video first. Don't worry about, all the other stuff. Start with a video. Start with a tracker. Start with one piece. Start small and then build up. That's definitely very common advice.
Yeah. And for me, this is a process that took months and months to figure out, was like how to give one lesson. I mean, I had a similar experience to you that I talk about in a book. I went to a Friday afternoon professional development where a teacher showed me Edpuzzle, how to take a video and put questions in. And I went home over the weekend. I didn't have kids yet, so I had my weekends, to myself. I spent some time over the weekend, like learning it. And I was in class the next week with a video. I was so excited, but the video was only a small step. After that, I had to figure out, okay, what do students do next? And then how do I make sure they're understanding? And it took me months to figure out this kind of lesson structure. It was just, try something new, figure out what works. I hope that given the guidance that I have in the book and that Modern Classrooms has, we can help other teachers go through that learning more quickly. But yeah, it is a process that takes time. Part 2 of the book is called Redesigning Courses. And that is, once you figure out how to give a good lesson, how do you put those lessons together in a coherent way that students can start moving at their own paces? So, David may finish 2 lessons in a day. Anna may need 3 days to finish that first lesson. Troy may not get there until Friday. So how do you organize all of those lessons? How do you put them together? How do you create a coherent experience for your students? And how do you make sure that, every student is hitting the key points of your course without getting super spread out? And so this is where I talk about things like the learning management system, progress tracking, sort of your routines and procedures that make your class work even when students are doing different lessons at the same time. So you go from a single lesson to maybe a sequence of 2 or 3 lessons in a row or 1 week at a time. But it's sort of that building up process from the lesson to the course. And that's part 2 of the book. And then part 3 is about redesigning instruction. And I think this is where it goes a little bit from manual into manifesto. But once you have your modern classroom up and running the way you want it to, how can you make a larger change to the way teaching and learning happens in your community? So that might mean getting your administrator on board. That means sharing what you're doing with family members. That means empowering your colleagues, right? How can you share this with your colleagues? They're busy. They may not really understand this modern classroom thing, but they face the same challenge as you do. How can you empower them? And then finally, if you're really, motivated, how can you shape the larger conversation around education? That's what you and I and all the podcast guests, I think, are ultimately trying to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to shape the conversation about what young people need and how to provide it. So that's part 3. And I think the idea is start with the lesson. Once you have that, make your course self-paced, and then think about how you can share it. And that's exactly my story. I started with a lesson. I got my courses running the way I did. I shared with Kareem. I shared with you. Here I am on this podcast sharing with our global community. Yep. So I wanted to tell my story, but also in a way that makes possible to others to follow the same trajectory.
Yeah, and of course, the book is now something that we can also share with others, or it will be when it comes out. And you mentioned that too. Sharing the book with administrators. I love that, actually. It's a great idea. I happen to work in a school that's already like heavily modern classroomsified. But we've spoken with so many teachers on the podcast who are the only ones in their school or even in their district, right? And I like that you included this in the book, because the model, we're not being prescriptive. We're not saying, like you said, no one at Modern Classrooms is saying it has to be exactly this way. It's the approach to teaching, right? It's the if we all agree that we have to find a way to meet every learner's needs, which I think we do. I think everyone agrees with that. Well, here is a possible solution, right? You don't have to do it exactly like the book says. You don't have to do it exactly like the mentorship program says. Both of them, I think, are designed and written, in the case of the book, to accommodate wherever people are coming from. And so it is very shareable, and it is a movement at this point, right? It's something that is changing classrooms around the world. And not to even mention the global community of teachers supporting each other within the world of modern classrooms, which is another incredible thing. And so, yeah, yeah, this has been great, Rob. Thank you so much for talking us through this book. And I can't recommend the book highly enough. I'm in the third part. I haven't quite finished it yet, but very, very well written, really resonates with me, very validating as a seasoned modern classrooms teacher. So thank you so much for joining me to talk about it. We always ask people what they hope to see in the future and what goals they have. And I feel like writing a book is a lot of people's like long-term goal, but you already did. What do you hope to see in the future? What goals do you have now? Like, you just checked off, I think, something from what everyone has on their bucket list. Like, what's next?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think the goal became clear to me in writing the book, which is the goal is really for every student to be appropriately challenged and appropriately supported every day. And that's something that, has been part of Modern Classroom's vision for a long time, but really resonates with me now that I have kids. And what do I hope when they go to school? And I hope that they are challenged. I hope they're supported. And I hope that for everyone else's kids too. And I think the book, I hope, is a step towards that. But I think there's a lot more work to be done too, beyond the book, and thinking about how else can Modern Classrooms support teachers? How can we perhaps support parents and administrators? I don't look at the book as mission accomplished. It's one resource of many, this podcast being another, all with the same goal in mind, which is every student appropriately challenged and appropriately supported every day. And so for me, having the book out means, okay, let me figure out the next thing that we can do to make instruction easier for teachers, more effective for students, more enjoyable for everyone involved.
Actually, I really like that. I like the way that you put that, because it's not like on to the next thing, right? It's the same goal. It's the same goal for all of it, and we just continue doing the work. That work, it never ends, challenging students and pushing them in class. So I really appreciate the way that you frame that. So before we close out, Rob, tell us again when this book comes out, how our listeners can get their hands on it, and also more about that giveaway.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the book will come out on February 5th. It will be available everywhere books are sold. But I hope my publisher isn't listening, because what I'll say is that there's also a lot for free that you can have out there. I think if you're listening to this, Modern Classrooms as a nonprofit is devoted to giving out resources for free. So there's all of Modern Classrooms resources. There's a website for the book, which has some more of the things featured in the book, and that will be in the show notes. You can find that. So I would love if you read the book, but more importantly, I hope the book just serves as an entry point into the whole world of Modern Classrooms and the resources that we provide. In terms of the giveaway, there's a very short form you can fill out that Zach will put in the show notes. I will look through that form. I'll randomly select a few people, and you will get an email with a way to order your free copy of the book. And to those of you who read the book, I really hope that you enjoy it and that it's meaningful to you. That was certainly my goal in writing it, was to inform you, to inspire you, and to help you succeed with each of your learners.
Yeah, and it has certainly been meaningful and enjoyable to me. So highly recommended. Rob, this has been great. It's so great to catch up with you again. Thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
I'll see you in another 4 years, Zach.
No, it'll be sooner this time. We'll get you back sooner. Listeners, remember, you can always email us at podcast@modernclassrooms.org. And you can find the show notes for this episode at podcast.modernclassrooms.org/221. And that's where you'll find the info for Rob's book and for the giveaway. We'll have this episode's recap and transcript uploaded to the Modern Classrooms blog on Friday. Oh, sorry, I moved that up myself without realizing it. Okay. We'll have this episode's recap and transcript uploaded to the Modern Classrooms blog on Friday, so be sure to check there or check back in the show notes for this episode if you'd like to access those. Also, we're asking our listeners to leave a review if this podcast has been helpful in supporting you to create a blended, self-paced, mastery-based learning environment that does help other folks find it. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, Rob. Have a great week, and we'll be back next Sunday. Thank you so much for listening. You can find links to topics and tools we discussed in our show notes for this episode. And remember, you can learn more about our work at www.modernclassrooms.org, and you can learn the essentials of our model through our free course at learn.modernclassrooms.org. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at modernclassproj, that's Proj. We are so appreciative of all you do for students in schools. Have a great week, and we'll be back next Sunday with another episode of the Modern Classrooms Project podcast.